Merci à tous d'être présents pour un sujet très important qu'est le numérique pour vous, acteurs de la culture.
So thank you for being present on a topic that is very important for you, actors of culture, actors of institutions that welcome the public, who were very impacted by the health crisis that we're slowly coming out of. You were also able to experiment with a growing use of digital. We often hear about digital sobriety, green IT, so a plethora of terms that I might take time to define. So responsible digital is something that arose in 2014, 2015, before we spoke about responsible and sustainable ITC. And the word responsible digital is a word that can include not just environmental questions, but it's also going to encompass the social dimension, the accessibility, the inclusiveness. And in this big bundle that is responsible digital, we have two approaches. The first one, which is green IT, which reduces the environmental impact and the social impact of the digital. And we have another approach, which is IT for green, which is an approach that considers digital as a tool to serve sustainability. So here, this is really going to be a question for all of you who are listening. It's going to be a question of arbitration of digital, where digital has its place. And it's good to develop digital, but the idea is to not maybe get out of this presentation by saying digital is good or digital is bad, but to have elements to be able to arbitrate where you need to include digital and where you shouldn't have some. I'm going to take a few minutes, I've forgotten I had this slide, to introduce the group that I'm part of. It is called Les Augures. It was created in April of 2020. These are 4 people, and we support cultural actors in their transition, in their adaptation and innovation. We support them in their CSR approach. We also support them for eco-production. We also try to federate the cultural players around what really is at stake for culture, which are the scenographics, the production, but also everything that revolves around digital, with labs for research and action, where all of the members are going to try to experiment with solutions that we will have discussed. As I was saying, museum and digital, there's a duality. Since the healthcare crisis, we have had to face this explosion of digital. So this was the way in which, during the health crisis, where all of these leisure venues closed, was a way to still reach the public. It was also a mission for all of you to make culture more widely available with a broader public. At the same time, museums and other leisure venues are faced with this urgency to reduce their environmental footprint. So the notion here is to think about the arbitration that you can make when you look at the main impacts of the cultural sector. We can see that the digital has an important place. It's part of the major impacts. We can see transport, mobility, food, energy that includes heating, and everything is between 2 and 5% of the greenhouse gas emissions, because for cinema and music, the carbon impact is above the rest. This means that today there's less impact in cinema and music that comes from the production of movies and music. There is an impact of video on demand and the screening of films. So digital has an invisible impact. We've often spoken about an immateriality. There's a growing awareness that there's an impact of digital because there's cloud, the immateriality, and browsing. All of this lexicon hasn't helped us to realize the actual materiality of all of these equipment, all of these services that we're going to develop. I like to use this image of a South African photographer called Dylan March, and he came to make photographs of metal mining throughout the world. This is the mine of Palabora, which is a copper mine in South Africa. And what you can see in the middle is not a dinosaur egg, it's the pure quantity of copper that has come out of this mine. So you can see a difference in the scale. It's also a photo that is going to talk about the pollution that is triggered by our equipment, because the issue with digital, and what I'd like you to keep from this presentation, is that we're going to talk a little about this is where we have the equipment, and that's where the greenhouse gas comes. And copper is a metal that we'll find in all of our digital equipment. It is also a metal that we will find in batteries, in all of the elements that are going to be used for this ecologic transition, this environmental transition. And in order to get this copper, where you have to crush the rock very finely, so you can only imagine the quantity of energy that this expands. And then with all of the earth that is left, you're going to put them in sort of natural tubs, or you're just going to discard it into nature without doing a decontamination of these soils, of these rocks that don't just contain copper, but also other pollutants that are extremely dangerous for biodiversity. So to talk about the impacts of digital, I'm going to start with the environmental impacts of digital. It is responsible of 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Today, there's more greenhouse gas emissions that come out of digital than from civil aviation. And what is even more worrisome is that the emissions increase by 8% per year, and this dates back to before the lockdowns. The 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions are figures that take into account the manufacturing of the equipment and the use, but not at the end of life. And we're going to talk about the electronic and electric waste that pollute a lot. So this represents 5% of the use of primary energy. 84% of the impact of this is due to the manufacturing of the equipment. So there's a real materiality to digital, and the consumption of the energy for digital is where we're going to distinguish the manufacturing of our equipment from its use. And all of these figures come out of a think tank called Green IT. According to them, 45% of the consumption of energy from digital that is being used is used for production, and 55% for its use. We're talking about an environmental impact, but also the economic and social ones. So often the various metals that you're going to find in your laptop or your smartphones come from countries that do not respect the rights of workers. There's also the question of big data that we call the new black gold. So all of the profiling of the users. There's also the question of the digital divide. I think that this is really something that is important for you, because we always talk about digital to broaden its audience, but there are 14 million people in France that do not have access to digital. It's one French person out of 6 that does not have access to digital, and there's this divide that we need to take into account. A lot of people can't access digital, and they just don't know how to use it. There's also the fact that digital is not going to change the collective experience that is also using a cultural event, the fact that it's in person and it creates togetherness. There's also a question of addiction, of the ecology of attention, and there's also health consequences about the waves. There are few studies about this, but you can't negate this. I don't have a slide on this. There's also political stakes and geopolitical stakes linked to digital. The movie Don't Look Up was talking about this with the meteorite, and Mars or the moon might be territories to explore, to go and extract minerals or commodities. We're also thinking about the depth of the sea that have cobalt or other metals there that we're going to use to manufacture our equipment. And I was thinking that these territories that have these equipments can be subject to very significant conflicts. And it is also something that we shouldn't neglect. Today, a quick point on the legislation. We have a legislation that is unfortunately not very strong as yet, not very prolific. In Europe, I have selected two conventions, two legislations. The first one was the Basel Convention, which is now 33 years old. It's a treaty to reduce the circulation of hazardous waste. It is when the rich countries started being a little bit ashamed of sending all of their waste to poor countries, and when poor countries wanted to regulate this to stop sending, where we stopped sending cargoes of waste to developing countries. I was saying that Switzerland and Ghana are currently looking to make sure that the Basel Convention, because, of course, it was circumvented a lot today. I don't know if you saw photos of waste of electronic waste, landfills of electronic components. There's a famous one in Ghana, and developed countries were able to circumvent this convention. And today, Switzerland and Ghana would like to change this convention so that countries that are importing and receiving the waste be consulted to know if they're accepting this arrival of waste or not. The other directive is ROHS, which is a European directive to limit the use of chemicals in our equipment, especially products like lead or mercury. And it is a directive that is regularly amended and in terms of the list of substances that is featured in it. In France, there are 3 laws that can be interesting on the subject of digital. We've got an AGEC law. We're ahead on circular economy with this law that says that we shouldn't waste. The AGEC law says that today on your electronic equipment, you should have an index of repairability, and you will soon have sustainability indices from a scale of 1 to 10. Internet provider also need to give you your data use in real time and their equivalent in greenhouse gases, because internet router probably consumes more than your refrigerator, so you could switch it off. So there's also a law on the environmental and digital, and it's going to raise awareness, and it forces you to integrate eco-conception in the training of engineers starting in September of 2022. It is a law that is also going to promote the reduction of energy from the data centers. It's also going to promote strategies for responsible digital at the level of groups of municipalities. There's also the law called Climate and Resilience, which follows the Citizens Convention for Climate. It can be interesting in terms of tendering. If you are replying to tenders, in a few years, it's going to be mandatory to have at least one environmental criteria in your tenders, and in the technical specs, they will need to take into account at least one SDG.
So a few indicators if you do want to introduce a responsible digital policy. I've mentioned 3 megaoctets, which is, or megabytes, a reference document presenting for digital services to reduce their environmental impact. There is a free part and a part you have to pay for. It's a standard, and you have that on the website of the ADEME, the GR491, which proposes 57 recommendations for the responsible production of digital services. And as we're talking about responsible digital technologies and there's a question of accessibility, there is another standard which is interesting, the RGEAA, which helps you enhance the accessibility of your digital services. Let's come back now briefly to hardware. As we said, it's really the key to this. If there's one thing you should remember, it's keep your hardware as long as possible, buy as little as possible. And we do tend, as I said, to think about energy use by our equipment. We think that is where the biggest impact is, but in fact most of the impact is in the manufacturing of the hardware. And today we have about 34 billion items of hardware for 4.1 billion users, so 8 items of equipment per user, out of a total of 223 million tons of equipment, hardware. So in a mobile phone, you have 70 different substances, some 50 metals. So it shows the extent and complexity of these tools, which unfortunately we treat as disposable, when in fact it is not. We only have 30 years of resources ahead of us to actually produce this hardware. And then I was also talking about the manufacturing of this hardware. Then there is the question of electric and electronic waste, which generally gets sent off at only about 20%. When you put your telephone or computer in a recycling system, only 20% of that hardware will actually be recycled. 80% of the equipment is not tracked or traced. We don't know where it's going, and it can end up in landfills. I'm sorry, there will be some good news later. I'm giving you all the bad news for the moment. But it's important to note just how serious these problems are. Then there's also a question of programs or scheduled obsolescence. The lifespan of computers has been divided by 3 in 30 years, so more and more of our hardware in France suffers from this. So the law of the 5 R's, reduce, reuse, recycle, refuse and resist, that's the rule you should apply. Really try to hang on to your phone. It's the best thing you can do today for the environment. And in an organization, what can you do? You can introduce a responsible purchasing policy with environmental criteria in your calls for tender by sending out questionnaires to your suppliers on their environmental and societal commitments, demanding minimal guarantees of 5 years, warranties of 5 years, and conducting eco-design of your equipment and services. Some good practices: choose the right hardware for your needs, because often people end up having to buy a telephone. People buy a telephone which in fact has a performance which is way more than they actually need. People don't need this if they're just going to do some email. And it can be better to buy a repaired, used computer if your use is going to be limited. So try to buy second-hand hardware that has been refurbished. You have some very good services available at the moment, so you shouldn't hesitate. Often people don't want to do this, but you really have to think about reuse. You have to be familiar with the labels. You should rent the equipment rather than buying it as well. for organizations, really try to pool hardware with other local companies, and then you can use environmental clauses. You can repair and maintain your hardware as much as possible. Try to revive it, to keep it as long as possible, and to take part in collection. We all know that at home we have a box in the office with lots of electronic waste. We don't know if it still works. So take some time at home or in your company to take part in collections of electronic waste, because recycling today costs a lot, because there are so many different metals in such small quantities that the recycling systems are not yet in place. But if today we all arrive en masse to hand in our hardware, the recycling systems will be able to take shape. And the idea should be that we return equipment each time we buy some equipment. So less hardware and keep it longer. A quick digression regarding email. We often talk about responsible approaches. We think we've cleaned out our mailbox and that we're being digitally responsible. But what I like is this diagram here, which shows that, in fact, that represents 0.2% of the carbon footprint of digital technologies for the storage of email. So email really isn't the problem, but the problem is video. Video represents 80% of the bandwidth of the web, and today online video generates 1% of world emissions, more than a country like Spain. And why are we involved here? Because 60 to 80% of the data is the share of culture in digital uses. So with Netflix, video on demand, it's 80% if you consider pornography as being part of culture, and then PlayStation and video games, music streaming. These are all part of the problem. And one important challenge is the rebound effect, which is something we have all seen in economics classes at high school. In culture, this is that with the development of digital cultural offerings, we end up with many different broadcasting systems, and this increases the emissions of the sector. Another effect of culture is going to be the increase in bandwidth. There's the example, for example, of the concert of Jean-Michel Jarre. I don't remember the exact figures, but there were 1,000 people present at the concert, and when he did it online, he multiplied that by 10. So, of course, we have to do the whole life cycle analysis. It probably did avoid some transport activities. But if you have people who are behind their computer and other people in the room, you can imagine, in fact, the carbon impact or footprint of the concert. A quick example of an interesting initiative by MyCanal, which decided to make its users more responsible by indicating the CO2 consumption of the video clips and encouraging people to choose their video quality. There's no point in watching high quality videos on your telephone or your computer. You should adjust the quality to the hardware that you're using. And one other list of best practice: select videos, optimize them. You have Unbreak, an excellent software program that enables you to optimize the quality of the video for the platform you're posting it on. Try to download rather than streaming. Try to deactivate automatic reading. And there's also that Netflix effect where we watch the whole series in one go. Try to choose the right format. And for digital services, we also talk about life cycle analysis. And we have to do this when we're developing a digital service. So really take the time to analyze your requirements. Do we need to do this digitally? Because since COVID, we've tended to switch over to all digital. And even if we have gone back to some person activities, so take the time at the beginning to analyze your need, then think about the design, use and production to try to really adopt this life cycle approach. And I'm going to finish with this quotation from Gutierrez: eco-designing a digital service requires greater precision because you need to respond to 80% of users with 20% of resources, but these constraints are extremely fertile. And the idea is not to stop digital, but to use it more responsibly and to think carefully about your needs. Thank you very much for your attention. Obviously, I went very quickly. I said 15 minutes. I could have talked about that all day, but I hope it made you want to look into this in more detail.
On a 1 minute.
We have 1 minute for one question if you really want to. Is there a question? The lady over here. Question in French or in English? In French.
Bonsoir.
Good evening. Very quickly, have you been around the stands here at the trade show and have you discussed with people from technology about their digital footprint and what do you think? Unfortunately, I haven't had time. I know that, for example, there is virtual reality, which is booming at the moment, and museums and organizations are being encouraged to develop their virtual reality. Even in the National Stimulus Recovery Plan, they're encouraging this. I know with the elections coming up, but in Macron's program, he encourages the development of virtual reality. And in fact, virtual reality, there are things that can be interesting. And I think what's dangerous is to get into an approach of black and white. Virtual reality can be just as interesting in some cases for people who are disabled or stuck in bed, to enable them to share some experiences which they would miss out on otherwise. Sometimes it can also avoid the need to buy a plane ticket to go and visit somewhere that you can visit virtually. The only danger, once again, is this question of the hardware. So virtual reality, okay, but why not pool the hardware and don't just do virtual reality? Go and visit an exhibition or visit a cultural venue. That's also a collective experience, and that is something that we shouldn't forget. With COVID, we have all entered this digital world, which I think has created a lot of digital fatigue. We're tired of screens, of video conferences. But I don't want to be anti-virtual reality, but I don't think we should encourage the development of virtual reality at all costs in cultural organizations. Thank you, dear Marguerite. We're going to have to close on that point. If you have any other questions, you'll be able to ask afterwards. We have to close the room now. And thank you infinitely to Marguerite and to our audience. And we will be continuing